Okay, Swiss Family Robinson, Chapter 2, A Landing and Consequent Occupations. By break of day we were all awake and alert, for hope as well as grief is unfriendly to lengthened slumbers. When we had finished our morning prayer, I said, "We now, my best beloved, with the assistance of heaven, must enter upon the work of our deliverance. The first thing to be done is to give to each poor animal on board a hearty meal. We will then put food enough before them for several days. We cannot take them with us, but we will hope it may be possible, if our voyage succeeds, to return and fetch them. Are you now all ready? Bring together whatever is absolutely necessary for our wants. It is my wish that our first cargo should consist of a barrel with gunpowder, 3 fowling pieces, and 3 carbines, with as much small shot and lead, and as many bullets as our boat will carry. 2 pairs of pocket pistols, and 1 of large ones, not forgetting a mold to cast balls in. Each of the boys, and their mother also, should have a bag to carry game in. You will find plenty of these in the cabins of the officers. We added a chest containing cakes of portable soup, another full of hard biscuits, an iron pot, a fishing rod, a chest of nails, and another of different utensils, such as hammers, saws, pincers, hatchets, augers, etc., and lastly, some sailcloth to make a tent. Indeed, the boys brought so many things that we were obliged to reject some of them, though I had already exchanged the worthless ballast for articles of use in the question of our subsistence. When all was ready, we stepped bravely each into a tub. At the moment of our departure, the cocks and hens began to cluck, as if conscious that we had deserted them, yet were willing to bid us a sorrowful adieu. This suggested to me the idea of taking the geese, ducks, fowls, and pigeons with us, observing to my wife that, if we could not find means to feed them, at least they would feed us. We accordingly executed this plan. We put 10 hens and an old and a young cock into one of the tubs and covered it with planks. We set the rest of the poultry at liberty in the hope that instinct would direct them towards the land, the geese and the ducks by water, and the pigeons by the air. We were waiting for my wife, who had the care of this last part of our embarkation, when she joined us loaded with a large bag, which she threw into the tub that already contained her youngest son. I imagined that she intended it for him to sit upon, or perhaps to confine him so as to prevent his being tossed from side to side. I therefore asked no more questions concerning it. The order of our departure was as follows. In the first tub, at the boat's head, my wife, the most tender and exemplary of her sex, placed herself. In the second, our little Francis, a lovely boy, 6 years old, remarkable for the sweetest and happiest temper, and for his affection to his parents. In the third, Fritz, our eldest boy, between 14 and 15 years of age, a handsome, curl-pated youth, full of intelligence and vivacity. In the fourth was the barrel of gunpowder, with the cocks and hens, and the sailcloth. In the fifth, the provisions of every kind. In the sixth, our third son, Jack, a light-hearted, enterprising, audacious, generous lad, about 10 years old. In the seventh, our second son, Ernest, a boy of 12 years old, of a rational, reflecting temper, well informed for his age, but somewhat disposed to indolence and pleasure. In the eighth, a father, to whose paternal care the task of guiding the machine for the safety of his beloved family was entrusted. Each of us had useful implements within reach. The hand of each held an oar, and near each was a swimming apparatus, in readiness for what might happen. The tide was already at half its height when we left the ship, and I had counted on this circumstance as favorable to our want of strength. We held the 2 paddles long ways, and thus we passed without accident through the cleft of the vessel into the sea. The boys devoured with their eyes the blue land they saw at a distance. We rowed with all our strength, but long in vain, to reach it. The boat only turned round and round. At length I had the good fortune to steer in such a way that it proceeded in a straight line. The 2 dogs, perceiving that we had abandoned them, plunged into the sea and swam to the boat. They were too large for us to think of giving them admittance, and I dreaded lest they should jump in and upset us. Turk was an English dog, and Flora a bitch of the Danish breed. Bitch means female dog.
Oh, I thought it meant the bad word.
Yeah, that word literally means a female dog. I was in great uneasiness on their account, for I feared it would not be possible for them to swim so far. The dogs, however, managed the affair with perfect intelligence. When fatigued, they rested their forepaws on one of the paddles, and thus with little effort proceeded. Jack was disposed to refuse them this accommodation, but he soon yielded to my argument that it was cruel and unwise to neglect creatures thrown on our protection, and who indeed might hereafter protect us in their turn by guarding us from harm and assisting in our pursuit of animals for food. Besides, added I, God has given the dog to man to be his faithful companion and friend. Our voyage proceeded securely, though slowly. But the nearer we approached the land, the more gloomy and unpromising its aspect appeared. The coast was clothed with barren rocks, which seemed to offer nothing but hunger and distress. The sea was calm. The waves, gently agitated, washed the shore, and the sky was serene in every direction. We perceived casks, bales, chests, and other vestiges of shipwrecks floating round us. In the hope of obtaining some good provisions, are you guys listening? I'm talking to Isis and Momo.
It's not a game where you have to concentrate.
Okay. In the hope of obtaining some good provisions, I determined on endeavoring to secure some of the casks. I bade Fritz have a rope, a hammer, and some nails ready, and to try to seize them as we passed. He succeeded in laying hold of two, and in such a way that we could draw them after us to the shore. Now that we were close on land, its rude outline was much softened. The rocks no longer appeared one undivided chain. Fritz, with his hawk's eye, already descried some trees, and exclaimed that they were palm trees. Ernest expressed his joy that we should now get much larger and better coconuts than he had ever seen before. I, for my part, was venting audibly my regret that I had not thought of bringing a telescope that I knew was in the captain's cabin, when Jack threw a small one from his pocket and with a look of triumph presented it to me. Drew a small one from his pocket.
What is triumph?
It's like victory.
Like this?
Yes, to triumph is to win. On applying it to my eye, I remarked that the shore before us had a desert and savage aspect, but that towards the left, the scene was more agreeable. But when I attempted to steer in that direction, a current carried me irresistibly towards the coast that was rocky and barren. By and by we perceived a little opening between the rocks near the mouth of a creek, towards which all of our geese and ducks betook themselves, and I, relying on their sagacity, followed in the same course. Sagacity is wisdom. This opening formed a little bay. The water was tranquil, and neither too deep nor too shallow to receive our boat. I entered it, and cautiously put on shore to a spot where the coast was about the same height above the water as our tubs, and where, at the same time, there was a quantity sufficient to keep us afloat. All that had life in the boat jumped eagerly on land. The dogs, who had swum on shore, received us, as if appointed to do the honors of the place, jumping round us with every demonstration of joy. The geese kept up a loud cackling, to which the ducks, from their broad yellow beaks, contributed a perpetual thorough bass. The cocks and hens, which we had already set at liberty, clucked. The boys, chattering all at once, produced together an overpowering confusion of sounds. To this was added the disagreeable scream of some penguins and flamingos, which we now perceived. The latter flying over our heads, the others sitting on the points of the rocks at the entrance to the bay.
It said there were palm trees, and it says they're penguins?
I guess maybe some types of penguins live where it's not so cold. The first thing we did on finding ourselves safe on terra firma was to fall on our knees and return thanks to the Supreme Being who had preserved our lives, and to recommend ourselves with entire resignation to the care of his paternal kindness. It's okay. Just wait a sec. Till the whistle stops, at least. We next employed our whole attention in unloading the boat. We looked about for a convenient place to set up a tent under the shade of the rocks, and having all consulted and agreed upon a place, we set to work. We drove one of our poles firmly into a fissure of the rock. This rested upon another pole, which was driven perpendicularly into the ground. What is perpendicular into the ground? Straight up. Yeah, this would be horizontal. Yeah, vertical, but perpendicular means a 90-degree angle. Remember you learned about that today? A right angle?
Oh, yeah.
So perpendicular lines meet at a 90-degree angle. So the ground is like this, so perpendicular would be like this. So this rested upon another pole, which was driven perpendicularly into the ground and formed the ridge of our tent. A frame for a dwelling was thus made secure. We next threw some sailcloth over the ridge, and stretching it to a convenient distance on each side, fastened its extremities to the ground with stakes. Lastly, I fixed some tenter hooks along the edge of one side of the sailcloth in front, that we might be able to enclose the entrance during night by hooking in the opposite edge. The chests of provisions and other heavy matters we had left on the shore. The next thing was to desire my sons to look about for grass and moss to be spread and dried in the sun to serve us for beds. During this occupation, I erected near the tent a kind of little kitchen. A few flat stones I found in the bed of a freshwater river served for a hearth. I got a quantity of dry branches. With the largest, I made a small enclosure round it, and with the little twigs, added to some of our turf, I made a brisk, cheering fire. We put some of the soup cakes with water into our iron pot and placed it over the flame, and my wife, with my little Francis for a scullion, took charge of preparing the dinner. In the meanwhile, Fritz had been reloading the guns.
I thought Francis was a boy's name.
It is.
I mean a girl's name.
It can be also a boy's name. With an C-E-S at the end is a girl's name. C-I-S at the end is a boy's name.
Okay.
In the meanwhile, Fritz had been reloading the guns, with one of which he had wandered along the side of the river. He had proposed to Ernest to accompany him, but Ernest replied that he did not like a rough, stony walk, and that he should go to the seashore. Jack took the road towards a chain of rocks which jutted out into the sea, with the intention of gathering some of the mussels which grew upon them. My own occupation was now an endeavor to draw the 2 floating casks on shore, but in which I could not succeed, for our place of landing, though convenient enough for our machine, was too steep for the cask. While I was looking about to find a more favorable spot, I heard loud cries proceeding from a short distance and recognized the voice of my son Jack. I snatched my hatchet and ran anxiously to his assistance. I soon perceived him up to his knees in water in a shallow, and that a large lobster had fastened its claws in his leg. The poor boy screamed pitiably and made useless efforts to disengage himself. I jumped instantly into the water, and the enemy was no sooner sensible of my approach than he let go his hold and would have scampered out to sea, but that I indulged the fancy of a little malice against him for the alarm he had caused us. I turned quickly upon him and took him up by the body and carried him off, followed by Jack, who shouted our triumph all the way. He begged me at last to let him hold the animal in his own hand, that he might present so fine a booty to his mother. Accordingly, having observed how I held it to avoid the gripe, he laid his own hand upon it in exactly the same manner. But scarcely had he grasped it than he received a violent blow on the face from the lobster's tail, which made him lose his hold, and the animal fell to the ground. Jack again began to bawl out, while I could not refrain from laughing heartily. In his rage, he took up a stone and killed the lobster with a single blow. Ernest, ever prompted by his savory tooth, bawled out that the lobster had better be put into the soup, which would give it an excellent flavor. But this his mother opposed, observing that we must be more economical of our provisions than that, for the lobster of itself would furnish a dinner for the whole family. I now left them and walked again to the scene of this adventure, must be a big lobster, and examined the shallow. I then made another attempt upon my 2 casks, and at length succeeded in getting them into it, and in fixing them there securely on their bottoms. On my return, I complimented Jack on his being the first to procure an animal that might serve for subsistence. "Ah, but I have seen something too that is good to eat," said Ernest, "and I should have got it if it had not been in the water, so that I must have wetted my feet." "Oh, that is a famous story," cried Jack. "I can tell you what he saw, some nasty mussels. Why, I would not eat one of them for the world. Think of my lobster."
My Jack is my favorite.
Who is speaking now? "That is not true, Jack, for they were oysters and not mussels that I saw. I am sure of it, for they stuck to the rock, and I know they must be oysters." "Fortunate enough, my dainty gentleman," interrupted I, addressing myself to Ernest. "Since you are so well acquainted with the place where such food can be found, you will be so obliging as to return and procure us some. In such a situation as ours, every member of the family must be actively employed for the common good, and, above all, none must be afraid of so trifling an inconvenience as wet feet." "I will do my best with all my heart," answered Ernest, "and at the same time I will bring home some salt, of which I have seen immense quantities in the holes of the rocks, where I have reason to suppose it is dried by the sun. I tasted some of it, and it was excellent." He set off and soon returned. What he brought had the appearance of sea salt, but was so mixed with earth and sand that I was on the point of throwing it away. But my wife prevented me, and by dissolving and afterwards filtering some of it through a piece of muslin, we found it admirably fit for use. "Why could we not have used some sea-water," asked Jack, "instead of having all this trouble?" "So we might," answered I, "if it had not a somewhat sickly taste." While I was speaking, my wife tasted the soup with a little stick with which she had been stirring it, and pronounced that it was all the better for the salt, and now quite ready. "But," said she, "Fritz has not come in, and then how shall we manage to eat our soup without spoons or dishes? Why did we not remember to bring some from the ship?" "Because, my dear, one cannot think of everything at once. We shall be lucky if we have not forgotten even more important things. But, indeed," said she, "this is a matter which cannot easily be set to rights." It's very distracting when you guys are playing and...
But we're listening.
I know, but you're quite excited and...
No.
I find it distracting. I see you guys moving all the time and...
But we're listening.
Anyway, just play quietly, okay?
We're not even making anything.
I know, you're not making sound, but you're moving a lot.
Well, yeah, it's because every time somebody gets a bad card, we move over.
Yeah, but you guys are fighting for the cards and stuff? Like...
No, it's because sometimes we make a mistake.
Okay, anyway, just saying, it is distracting when you're moving a lot like that.
Stop! Okay. Are you going to post this video?
"But, indeed," said she, "this is a matter which cannot be easily set to rights. How will it be possible for each of us to raise this large boiling pot to his lips?" I soon saw that my wife was right. We all cast our eyes upon the pot with a sort of stupid perplexity, and looked a little like the fox in the fable when the stork desires him to help himself from a vessel with a long neck. Silence was at length broken by all bursting into a hearty laugh at our want of every kind of utensil, and at the thought of our own folly in not recollecting that spoons and forks were things of absolute necessity. Ernest observed that if we could but get some of the nice coconuts he often thought about, we might empty them and use the pieces of the shells for spoons. Yes, yes, replied I, if we could but get, but we have them not. And if wishing were to any purpose, I had as soon wish at once for a dozen silver spoons. But alas, of what use is wishing? But at least, said the boy, we can use some oyster shells for spoons. Why, this is well, Ernest, said I, and is what I call a useful thought. Run then quickly for some of them. Jack ran first and was up to his knees in the water before Ernest could reach the place. Jack tore off the fish with eagerness and threw them to the slothful Ernest, who put them into his handkerchief. What does slothful mean?
I don't know.
Do you know what a sloth is?
Oh, yes. Like the animal sloth?
Yes. What's distinctive about the
Slowly.
sloth? Yes, so slothful would mean slowly. So Jack tore off the fish with eagerness and threw them to the slothful Ernest, who put them into his handkerchief. Fritz, not having yet returned, his mother was beginning to be uneasy, when we heard him shouting to us from a small distance, to which we answered by similar sounds. In a few minutes he was among us, his 2 hands behind him, and with a sort of would-be melancholy air, which none of us could well understand. What have you brought? Asked his brothers. Let us see your booty, and you shall see ours. Ah, I have unfortunately nothing. What? Nothing at all? Said I. Nothing at all, answered he. But now, on fixing my eye upon him, I perceived a smile of proud success through his assumed dissatisfaction. At the same instant, Jack, having stolen behind him, exclaimed, A sucking pig! A sucking pig! Fritz, finding his trick discovered, now proudly displayed his prize, which I immediately perceived, from the description I had read in different books of travels, was an agouti, an animal common in that country, and not a sucking pig, as the boys had supposed. Fritz related that he had passed over to the other side of the river. Ah, continued he, it is quite another thing from this place. The shore is low, and you can have no notion of the quantity of casks, chests, and planks, and different sorts of things washed there by the sea. Ought we not to go and try to obtain some of these treasures? We will consider it soon, answered I, but first we have to make our voyage to the vessel and fetch away the animals. At least you will all agree that of the cow we are pretty much in want. If our biscuit were soaked in milk, it would not be so hard, observed our dainty Ernest. I must tell you, too, continued Fritz, that over on the other side there is as much grass for pasturage as we can desire, and besides a wood in the shade of which we could repose. Why then should we remain on this barren desert side? Patience, replied I, there is a time for everything, friend Fritz. We shall not be without something to undertake tomorrow, and even after tomorrow. But, above all, I am eager to know if you discovered, in your excursion, any traces of our ship companions. Not the smallest trace of man, dead or alive, on land or water, replied Fritz. Soon after we had taken our meal, the sun began to sink into the west. Our little flock of fowls assembled round us, pecking here and there what morsels of our biscuit had fallen on the ground. Just at this moment my wife produced the bag she had so mysteriously huddled into the tub. Its mouth was now opened. It contained the various sorts of grain for feeding poultry, barley, peas, oats, etc., and also different kinds of seeds and roots of vegetables for the table. In the fullness of her kind heart she scattered several handfuls at once upon the ground, which the fowls began eagerly to seize. Our pigeons sought a resting place among the rocks. The hens, with the 2 cocks at their head, ranged themselves in a line along the ridge of the tent, and the geese and ducks betook themselves in a body, cackling and quacking as they proceeded, to a marshy bit of ground near the sea, where some thick bushes afforded them shelter. A little later we began to follow the example of our winged companions, by beginning our preparations for repose. First, we loaded our guns and pistols, and laid them carefully in the tent. Next, we assembled together and joined in offering up our thanks to the Almighty for the succor afforded us, and supplicating his watchful care for our preservation. With the last ray of the sun, we entered our tent, and, after drawing the sailcloth over the hooks to close the entrance, we laid ourselves down close to each other on the grass and moss we had collected in the morning. End of chapter 2.